I'm told to just go ahead and jump in and start. We're starting here at 1 o'clock, and I know there's another session at 2:30, and they want to keep everything on time, so we're going to try to jump right in. But we hope this will be as interactive a session as possible. There's kind of a smaller group. Please feel free to move to the front or make a big circle or whatever you want to do, but we would love to have questions and comments. Particularly at the end, we've got some things we want to share initially, but we would love to have you all participate as much as possible. There's a full bio of everybody on the Stellar panel in your brochure that you would have gotten. If somebody doesn't have that and wants to have that information, Catherine over here has some extras. I'll make kind of a brief introduction of everybody, but I'm not going to read the entire bio, but that's all in here, so feel free to scrutinize that and check us out. So my name is Julia Lunsford. I'm the one member on this panel who's actually graduated the class of 75. We're not the thing I got yesterday, Priceless Gym Luncheon. Just kind of squeaked in. I went to summer school and graduated in December of 75, but I'm officially there, so I'll stand proudly next to another class tomorrow we're commencing. Here is Dr. Mara Buckbinder, who's a professor in the social medicine department at UNC, and most notably, the author of this very compelling book titled Scripting Death, which is about her research into the experience of medical aid and dying in the state of Vermont. And she'll be talking some about that in a few minutes, but just wanted to point out her book that you might have some interest in. Next to her is Dr. Kyle Lavin, who's a physician at UNC, and he's certified in both psychiatry and palliative care medicine. So we're glad to have his input. Then we've got Deborah Love next. Deb has any number of degrees, so it's hard to keep up with them all. She's a JD, an MBA, an MA, she's a bioethicist, has lots of wonderful thoughts and things that she could produce to conversations of this sort, so I'm really delighted that she's here. And then Daryl Owens at the end of the table is a chaplain at UNC. I can't remember what your undergrad degree was in. I know you got an MDiv from Duke. And you got you're an official UNC grad too there, class of 93. So Daryl's going to kind of add to the conversation, bringing in more perspective of sort of religious or spiritual nature that might be pertinent as we're thinking about some of these issues related to end of life, particularly medical aid and dying. So, with that being said, I've got a brief PowerPoint outline to show to provide a little bit of background information, particularly about medical aid and dying, because I don't know that a lot of people know a whole lot about that. It kind of makes sense because we don't have it available in North Carolina at this point. But it is something that is becoming more and more interest. 2/3 of people in the United States with polls say they're in favor of it. At this point, if I have to update one of my slides, there are now 12 states that offer medical aid and dying. So let me just, so these are our names again. These are those of us here on the panel. And I would just say a few words about who we, the class of 1979, are. We're in our 8th decade of life now, so we're kind of getting on up there with baby boomers. We probably remember the Beatles debut of the Ed Sullivan Show. Probably knew somebody who died in Vietnam. No doubt you may remember exactly where you were when you heard that JFK was assassinated. We had mothers who were probably more likely to have been homemakers, nurses, teachers, or secretaries. Part of the sandwich generation, meaning that we probably had been involved to continue to raise kids. There was some who were boomerang backwards. We thought they were launched, now they're back, and then we also have parents who are perhaps living longer and we're dealing with care for them as well. And then I think one thing that's particularly unique about our cohort, if you will, and that might be in particular significance in thinking about some of these topics today, is that there seems to be a tendency among baby boomers to question traditions' desire for autonomy and control, and maybe more specifically wanting to have some control over the type of death that they have. But we may be less likely to have engaged in conversations about death and dying. I don't know whether it's quite appropriate to bring up Woody Allen's name anymore, but he does have a quote that I really appreciate, which is, "It's not that I'm afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens." So we don't talk about this too much. But it's important that we do. In fact, there's just some thoughts as to maybe why we don't, maybe other reasons besides these, but denial, fear, uncertainty, religious beliefs, they keep us talking about it. But this highlights a group called Conversation Project, which was founded in 2010 by Ella Goodman, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. She co-founded the Conversation Project in part because she had an experience with her mother with dementia. And although they were very close, she says that they talked about everything except how her mother wanted to live at the end of life. And so she's really put together some good resources and information to help people have some of these conversations with their family members. Also, kind of related to this is that I think it was in 2008, National Healthcare Decision Day was started. That's the day that's been designated for that is April 16th, the day after tax day. It was chosen in part because of Ben Franklin's quote, the two things that are, we know for sure, they like are debt and taxes. So that's a day in which we want to try to be particularly mindful of dealing with those kinds of things. And then a few comments about what we did call MAID for short, stands for Medical Aid in Dying. It sometimes is called by other names, Right to Die, Death with Dignity, Physician Aid in Dying, and I think at some point maybe Physician Aid in Suicide. But I want to really point out that this is not suicide, it's not euthanasia, and I'll go through the criteria in just a few minutes. This is where there's a mistake on this slide. I've got this available in 11 states, including the District of Columbia. But just in April, Delaware is now a state that's been added to the list. And there are any number of states, I want to say as many as 20, that have bills ongoing and are in the process of perhaps working towards that as well. Oregon was the first state back in 1994, so there's quite a bit of experience with MAID dating back to Oregon. Most other states that follow the template similar to what Oregon set up, with some differences and distinctions. But 1 in 5 Americans actually live in a state where MAID is available. And it's noted that Vermont and Oregon are 2 states that don't have in-state residency requirements. So you could go to that state and you live somewhere else and potentially access MAID that way. There are other ways perhaps to hasten death, and this might be of interest or relevance if you live in a state that doesn't have MAID. One of them is certainly by having your advance directives, in which you try to designate what treatments you would and wouldn't want. You can choose to withdraw treatment that you started, such as dialysis or chemotherapy. You can aggressively treat pain with opioids, which may have the effect of hastening death. There's something called palliative or terminal sedation, where there's more of a focus on comfort care. And then what's known as VSED, which stands for voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. I think Deborah will maybe talk a bit more about this, but this is another option that people may have if they want to take some control over trying to hasten their death. In terms of MAID, there are pretty strict criteria, so not just anyone can access this. You have to be over the age of 18. There has to be a terminal diagnosis with presumably a prognosis of less than 6 months to live. The person has to have capacity and competence. They have to be able to make this choice voluntarily for themselves. Nobody can do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. And this essentially eliminates anyone who would have dementia if they wanted to access this, because by the time they're in around 6 months of life, they wouldn't have full capacity or competence. You have to be able to administer the medications on your own. It can't be IV, be oral, feeding tube, or rectal tube. I think there's some interesting statistics that over 75% of people who apply for MAID have a cancer diagnosis, so that's the most common. 15% of people have a neurological disorder such as ALS, 10% cardiovascular disease. About 95% of people who apply are white, 72% college educated, and about a 50-50 rate between male and female. And then a really interesting statistic, and maybe Dr. Ladwell has some thoughts about this, but 90% of people are on hospice. So it's not like an either or kind of thing. Somebody might be interested in MAID, but also be going to take advantage of hospice care. And roughly 1/3, or maybe a little bit more than 1/3, never take the medications. So for some people, it's thought to be almost like an insurance policy. When you get fire insurance, you don't want your house to burn down, but you want to make sure you've got something to protect you if it does. So that's, I think, interesting. Other safeguards, again, this has to be totally voluntary, you can't apply for another person. There's typically a waiting period on this. Is changing in some states, but on average it's tended to be about 15 days between the first and the second request. You have to be screened by a medical provider who has to inform the patient of other options and screen for depression. And a patient can change their mind at any time. And providers and facilities do not have to administer days, so nobody's forced to do that. And then these are some questions that we are kind of interesting to ponder as we're considering this topic. So, and maybe preparation for our Q&A a little bit later, maybe these are things to think about, or you may have other ones that you want to bring to the table. But what is a good death? Is there such a thing as a good death? How old do you want to be when you die? How would you hope not to die? How would you hope to die? Should your current self be able to make decisions for your future self? And is it worse to die too soon or live too long? Several kind of provocative type questions. And then it's just a nice slide up here at the end. We're all just walking each other home. So that's kind of a little PowerPoint part. I'm going to now turn to Dr. Lavin, who's going to start out sharing some of his experience and how he deals with patients and families and having some of these conversations.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Julia, appreciate it. I'll start off by just saying, really excited to be here. It feels like a privilege to be in a place where we can talk about these difficult topics, not only just death and dying, but the topic of medical aid and dying. So I will clarify I'm not an expert in medical aid and dying, but really excited to have people here on the panel with me who can speak to that. But I will share a little bit of my story, sort of how I got into palliative care, talk a little bit about palliative care in general, just dispelling some of the myths around that. And I was going to bring up a tough case that I had yesterday that was really poignant, but I think can maybe help ground us in the conversation today about what things can look like. So, I'm Kyle Lavin, palliative care psychiatrist. I've been on faculty at UNC for a little bit under 10 years. The way I got into palliative care is that my dad's a psychiatrist, and I was going to fight very hard not to be a psychiatrist. My joke, it's a bad joke, but I was a pretty good kid, but there were two things that I was going to do to rebel. I was never going to be a psychiatrist, my dad was a Duke fan, and I was always going to be a target. So I'm still a target. Go Eagles, we're all here for that. As you can see, I did not keep second, but I ended up becoming a psychiatrist. And the reason for that is that I unfortunately had a mom who had really bad scoliosis, had back surgery when I was 10 years old, developed both chronic mental health problems, alcohol use disorder, and then physical problems, and then throughout my teenage years was chronically ill, and then she unfortunately actually ended up passing away between my junior and senior year of undergrad. And I share that story just from my personal experience of how totally overwhelming it can be to have loved ones die, and the pressure that I felt as this 20-year-old kid was making decisions for my mom at the end of life. And what that was like, again, somewhat traumatic in certain ways, but I have these very clear memories of these two clinicians, one of whom was incredibly empathic, held space for me to grieve, to ask questions, to not feel like I was forcing the decisions that needed to be made, and really embodied the principles of palliative care. And then another clinician who I felt very rushed by, which is very traumatizing to feel like I was not in a place where I could feel supported in making those decisions. And so made the decision to go back to medical school to approach palliative care via psychiatry, because I think there is so much psychological overlap of comorbidities from a psychiatric perspective, but also the psychological process of finding meaning and making decisions at the end of life. And so did my psychiatry residency at Vanderbilt, and then went out to the University of Washington to do my palliative care fellowship, and learned a lot about integrated behavioral health, but also was trained in a state where access to medical aid and dying is legal. And so had several cases where I was part of that and was able to go through that experience. Came back to UNC and then have been on faculty, as I said, for almost 10 years there. So I'll transition just briefly to palliative care as a whole. I'll sort of ask a question just by show of hands of who here feels like they have a good understanding of what palliative care is, what the difference is between palliative care and hospice. Most people, just a few hands, so yeah, a lot of people don't. So the palliative care became an official medical specialty in around 2010 or so. The principles of palliative care are to help people with serious illness who have some sort of life-limiting illness. We focus on excuse me, 3 major areas of care. The first is helping people have the best quality of life no matter what's going on. So treating their symptoms, pain, nausea, shortness of breath, anxiety, depression. So that's pretty straightforward. The second bucket that we help in is this communication bucket. And I think of myself, I wish that the field of palliative care didn't have to exist and that medical specialists had the time and training to have these conversations, but I think of myself a little bit like a translator for the medical system, where I get to learn who people are, what's most important to them, what their values are, and I help them understand what's going on with their medical condition, because unfortunately we throw a lot of jargon at people. It's really hard to truly understand what's happening, and then what I tell people is that I want to help people hope for the best, but also be prepared for the worst, and that if we were to get more sick and things don't go the way we want, what do we want life to look like? And that's where the conversation's about what does a good death look like, how can we have as much control over that as possible, and how do we have those conversations? So again, just glad that people are here and open to having these discussions and thinking about these difficult topics. And then the last bucket, what we do is providing support, recognizing that people outside of the medical illness that they're undergoing, outside of the 4 walls of the hospital, have a whole life, and trying to make meaning out of finding a way to live your life when you know that life is limited and you have less time than you want. It's really difficult, so we try to support people through that. I do want to just sort of dispel the myth. Palliative care is for people with life-limiting illness, but is appropriate at any stage of care. And so it's rare, but sometimes when I get to know people, I understand what their values are. They're hearing from the doctors, oh, there's nothing else to do, there's nothing we can do for you. There are actually cases where I advocate for getting more treatment, right? So palliative care does not mean death and dying. There is a difference with hospice, that hospice, in order to qualify for that, you do have to have a life expectancy that is 6 months or less, and the focus really is on dying as well as possible, having the best quality of life that you have for the time left. I'll transition a little bit just to the case that I had yesterday, and we'll pass it over to the next speaker. But I had this 37-year-old woman who has metastatic colon cancer, and the consult request came in about a month ago to our palliative care group. And the consult request said, patient asked their oncologist about medical aid in dying. Will you be able to see the patient? And it sparked this sort of conversation amongst our palliative care group that some of the people in our group were very uncomfortable talking about it, thinking about it. And I said, yeah, of course, I'm happy to see this patient. And during the conversation, through my palliative care evaluation, asking open-ended questions about what her values were, asking things about what are you hoping for the most, what are you most worried about, where do you get your strength from, what makes life meaningful to you. I was able to get from her, right, that this desire for information around medical aid and dying is coming from a desire to have control, and this fear and uncertainty about what's coming down the road is really overwhelming, and we don't go through death and end of life much, and that's a great thing, but when we do, we need to have access to resources and information that can help us feel like that we're in control of the process. And so I was able to consult. I certainly educated her on medical aid and dying, what the resources are, where the states are that it's legal, but in my mind, right, the goal of palliative care is that if we do our job really, really well and hospice is involved at the right time, that medical aid and dying shouldn't be needed a lot of the time. But I think it's an incredibly important tool, and that if we are afraid to talk about it, if we're not able to come together as a group and know that it's a resource and an option, that it becomes more and more difficult to even have the conversation. So I'll wrap it up with that and pass it on. Who's the?
Thanks, that's great. Mayor Sophie next.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It takes a special kind of person to show up for a panel on this topic on a beautiful spring day, so I hope we'll make it worth your while. So my name is Mara Bookbinder. I'm a medical anthropologist, and I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Social Medicine at UNC, which is a interdisciplinary department in the School of Medicine that teaches a curriculum in the social sciences and humanities to pre-clinical medical students. And I've been here at UNC for 15 years. And I'm here today because I did a research study in beginning of 2015 that culminated in my book about medical aid and dying in Vermont. And I decided to go to Vermont in 2015 because I really wanted to understand what MAID looks like when it's brand new. And at that point in time, it was the state in the US that had most recently legalized. They had legalized in 2013. And so it was a time when they were really kind of beginning to implement it and figure out what it was going to look like in practice. The way that the Vermont law was implemented was actually the first state that passed this through the state legislature. And for a variety of political reasons that I won't get into right now, it was passed without any kind of regulatory structure in place from the Department of Health. And so there was a long process of kind of figuring out how do we do this, for physicians to figure out how do I do this, what do I prescribe, what does this mean, and for patients to figure out how they can access this option. And so what I did is I went to Vermont over several years. I spent summers there, and I went there for shorter periods of time during the year, and I spoke with patients and clinicians, so physicians, but also nurses, social workers, hospice administrators, and some of the policy stakeholders as well. The state legislators who had worked on the law, some of the advocates that had lobbied both for and against the law, to really try to understand how did this come to be and what does it look like now that it's here. And because I was looking at Vermont, which is a really small state, I was able to talk to a lot of the key players in the state and to track a lot of the cases that had occurred at that time, because it wasn't very many cases that had actually occurred at the time that I started the study. And the goal of my research really was to kind of uncover some of the previously hidden narratives about MAID. It was a time when MAID was very much kind of in the public eye, and there were lots of media stories about it, but my hunch was that what is actually happening may not fit with some of the popular conceptions that are based on the media stories. So I want to just talk about a couple myths that I identified through my research and some of the counter narratives that I was able to uncover. And so one of them is around the notion of access. So I think there has been this idea that the biggest barrier to medical aid and dying in the United States is the legalization, the legal status of the practice in your state. And so there's been this idea that I think has been promoted by a lot of the advocacy organizations that the main impediment is whether or not it's legal in your state. And so they've made the case, why shouldn't this be legal in North Carolina? Why should your ability to access this option depend on the state in which you happen to live? Whereas if you lived, several hundred miles to the north in Washington, D.C., or some of the New England states, you might have access to this. And what I found in my research is that the legal status within the state was not the only impediment. I found that patients in Vermont were having a very difficult time accessing medical aid and dying even after it was legalized, because it was difficult for them to find physicians that were willing to participate. And it was really a very difficult process for many to find out that just because it was legal in their state, that didn't mean that they were going to be able to get it. And that process has been mirrored in a lot of the other states that have legalized since then. So the second myth, I think, was around the physician's role. And I don't know, whether any of you in the audience have a background in medicine, but this has been a hotly debated issue in medical ethics around kind of the physician's role in medically aided dying, whether or not it's ethical for physicians to participate. And I think that there is this unspoken assumption that participation means you either write the prescription or you don't. And one thing that I found in my research is that physicians' attitudes around medically aided dying are not that black and white. And that there were ways of participating that sort of occupied a murkier gray area, where sometimes physicians would be willing to kind of participate in other ways, maybe to help their patients find a different physician willing to prescribe, willing to help them plan for their death, and various other ways that they could contribute without actually writing a prescription. And so I really wanted to kind of open up this idea of what it means for physicians to participate in medical aided dying. It's not just the act of writing a prescription. There are lots of questions around communication and counseling and how much physicians are willing to kind of go down that path with their patients. And then the third myth that I just wanted to briefly highlight has to do with ideas about individualism and independence. And we know the data has shown really clearly that a desire for autonomy and control over the dying process is a primary motivation for why patients in the United States want to choose medical aid in dying. And there's also a really strong notion that terminally ill patients pursue MAID because they don't want to be dependent on other people for end-of-life care. And so there's a sense that MAID is kind of this act of radical individualism where you're not going to have other people take care of you at the end of your life. And given that narrative, I was really surprised to find out that medical aid in dying is actually an extraordinarily relational practice. Right? So it's not one that allows people to be completely cut off from society. They were actually really calling on their relationships with others to walk through this process and to plan their deaths. And then it was sort of creating these new kinds of social relationships and intimacies in the pathway leading up to death. It was enabling them to avoid certain kinds of dependency, sure, and often people would talk about not wanting to be dependent on others for bodily care and for toileting kind of in those last few weeks of life. Yet they were at the very same time developing these new kinds of dependencies in order to think about and to contemplate medical aid in dying and to have a support network that could help you walk through it. And so what I found was the people that were pursuing it, they were not people that were kind of cut off from society. They were people with very, very strong social relationships. And I think that is a really important finding of my research because it can help to dispel some of these myths about the kind of person that might want to pursue this practice. And one of the kind of most interesting parts of the research for me was to hear about how people planned for their deaths and even choreographed their deaths in community and in collaboration with the people that matter most to them in their lives, and to kind of see how those deaths were planned and were really dramatized in a sense. So I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer more questions about the research when we get to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was really, really enlightening, and particularly that last aspect of maybe we're addressing regarding the relational aspect of that, that particularly useful. All right, Deb, you're up next.
Hello, I'm Deb Love, and I have some things that are different from the rest of, in my background, different from the rest of the panel and from you all. So I think I'm going to Carolina. I have another shade of blue that I wear, and it's not too blue. It goes along with maize and blue in Michigan. But I will say, Carolina has a lot of my money. Because my daughter knows what shade of blue to support. Also, I didn't start my life in the medical field. I started in organization development, trying to help organizations create enriching environments for their employees through how they design work and particularly how their leadership functions and doing executive coaching. But there were some pivotal parts in my life that led me to the path of sort of later in life going into bioethics. One of those I didn't realize was really when I was very, very young. My favorite grandmother had a stroke when I was 8 and a half. And she lingered in a skilled nursing facility for 18 months, and all she could say was kooky, kooky, kooky. That's another difference that we have today, is that we have much better treatments now for stroke and better understanding. But that was a very emotional time for me as a kid, for someone who I cared for so much. Fast forward, in 1998, my mother was experiencing a number of health issues, and that led her to dialysis. She also had congestive heart failure, a number of other things. She elected to withdraw from dialysis. And she did that knowing that she would die within a week. So she was, I guess, if you're looking at this from the perspective of people who want to exercise their autonomy, she had that option readily available to her. A few years later, likewise, a very close friend and business partner of mine had Parkinson's and made the decision to stop taking her medications with the support of hospice and knowing that she would die within a few days. Again, she had that option because of the nature of her illness. And I think there are many people, certainly in my life as a clinical ethics consultant, working in hospitals at the bedside with patients and families at end of life, and seeing the whole spectrum, and see what happens when people have not thought about these matters and not discussed them and not had wonderful doctors like Dr. Lavin who start with a really clear, compassionate communication of diagnosis and prognosis with people and understanding of their goals of care and how really wrenching that can be for patients and families. So I guess I come at this from saying I want to support people in whatever their value system is. And we see people across the spectrum. We see people who would like to, like Dr. Lavin's patient, have the opportunity to consider making that choice. And we have others who want to have treatment right up to the very last minute. And it's our role to support them and support their value system as best we can in the healthcare system. Today we're talking about predominantly talking about people who want to make the choice to exercise a decision that may hasten their death at their own volition. There are some interesting developments. So I think Mara's research is very helpful in uncovering some of these myths. And I would say it's different in different states. So you focus on Vermont, it's different in different states. Some states, like Oregon, have had methylating dying for a long time. There have been several attempts in North Carolina to get legislation passed on behalf of May. And they pretty much never made it out of committee. We all know this is a very conservative state. There is a new approach that was introduced, the bill, House Bill 410, was filed in April. And the approach they're taking is, let's let the North Carolina Institute of Medicine study MAID and really delve into all of these elements of it. And I mean, I think it's an interesting, I'll call it an end around. Frankly, I don't think it's going to make much difference, but it would be a valuable study if funded. The other thing that's relatively new is that some of the states that have had residency requirements, so in addition to the list of requirements that Julia gave us, several states have had residency requirements of like 6 months before you could access medical aid and dying. Have decided that that's not really constitutional because we don't deprive people from medical care for other reasons. So Oregon has overturned their residency requirement, and Vermont has recently overturned that by legislation. In Oregon, it was overturned by the courts. There was also pending a court case in New Jersey, which may ultimately go to the Supreme Court, in which case it would be decided for all states. But at least in Oregon and Vermont, the barriers to access aside, and that's very clear in Vermont, maybe a little bit less so in Oregon, would say that it would be possible to go there and not have a waiting period. That said, I don't think anybody is suggesting that you could take that drug across state lines and bring it back home here. So one would have to make a commitment to carry through the process in that state. And as Julia pointed out, about a third of the people who access this drug don't actually use it, maybe more than that in some states. And I think it is something that people want as a peace of mind kind of thing. I have this option if I want this option, but I suspect that Kyle will agree and Daryl will agree that the one thing I've learned is that people at end of life change their minds. And they change their minds in both directions, right? So people think, I'm really wimpy, I can't stand this pain, boy, I want anything to avoid pain, and then they get into the process, and maybe it's the fear of death, or maybe it's just because they're still in deep connection with their family. They say, whoa, wait a minute, I can take more than I wanted. And the reverse is true as well. People who think they're really tough, and they just get tired. So it's really hard to predict in advance. Which leads me to another topic I just want to touch on briefly, because I do consult with our continuing care retirement community here in Chapel Hill. And I will tell you the biggest fear in that community is dementia. And they want some way to be able to control the dying process where dementia is concerned. Now, there are a lot of people in the bioethics world and most of the bioethics world talking about advanced directives for dementia. The idea being that you would pick some kind of trigger point, say, I can't recognize my loved ones, and saying in an advanced directive, when that happens, I don't want you to feed me. This is not accepted anywhere in the United States. I don't foresee it being acceptable in the near future. That said, there are a lot of attorneys who are writing these advanced directives for people. And, I don't tell people don't do it. If it's that important to you, fine, because it does give indication to folks like you about what people's intentions are, right? So that when the person when the dementia advances, that perhaps there'll be less aggressive treatments. So, anyway, that's just on the horizon, but the real ethical issue about that is whether, because we change our minds, and because the progression of dementia is so different in different people, whether this current self should be able to make that kind of decision for our future self. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. Pass it along.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. I'm glad to see this many people here. And yes, I have the right shade of blue on the prodigal. Even when I was at Duke, they knew I was a Tar Heel, so that's a question. My role as chaplain and grief counselor, especially working in oncology, psychiatry, and with parents who are losing babies. So I'm dealing with death from many different aspects. And I must say, I've worked with Deb on ethics cases, and she's wonderful. And I have witnessed Kyle, his work with patients at end of life. You want someone like Kyle, okay? The thing I always encourage people to do, have conversations about death and dying before you're sick, before you have a diagnosis. Why? Because it's not driven by fear. When I began to work in hospital chaplaincy and working with death and dying, I began to open up those conversations with my parents. My dad was clergy, and he was a World War II vet, and he had certain things that he wanted. Dad wanted everything. He wanted you to fight for his life, and even at the end of life, he did with several, there's research out there about veterans of war who may fight death at the end of life because it's the flashbacks. And my dad went through that. My mom, on the other hand, she died with Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. But I opened up the conversations with them while everybody was healthy. And they're like, we don't need to talk about this, we do. And I actually had those conversations with my kids. And I picked out my son-in-law because he thinks a lot like me. And I told him when my time comes, even dealing with Alzheimer's or just, we don't know what may carry us out. The fact is, each one of us in this room is going to die. It's not a secret. So therefore, preparing for it, because there's a rippling effect when it comes to death and dying. Those who survive you. And if we don't talk about it, I've seen so many, and Kyle, we've seen it too, at the end of life, where people are trying to guess what someone wants because they're not able to make decisions and they never talked about the death and dying process, what they would want, well, I think this is what they would want. Do you know that's a lot of undue pressure that doesn't need to be there? How does your spirituality come up? Everyone has a spirituality. One researcher said spirituality is what makes you breathe, not respiratory wise. But as a person, what gives you that aha moment? Or what helps you connect with nature or the sun or being able to enjoy a beautiful day like this? Everyone has a spirituality. Everyone does not express it through religion. Many do, many don't. So whatever you see as a good death, however, whether it's with maid, I don't care, hospice, whatever, have those conversations with those who are going to be affected by it. Because the journey is with them as well. Meaning, since I've been working in death and dying for so many years, I used to tell my children, I'm a granddad, so my kids are all grown and everything. I used to say, this is what I want. I want to be cremated, I want this, and I want that, and I want the other. And one day, because we've talked about it so much, my kids are pretty open about talking about this subject matter. And they said, Dad, did you ever think about us and what we want at that time? And I said, truthfully, no, I haven't. And I'm like, you brought up a good conversational topic. So we began to say, this is what I would like, but I don't know what's going to be going on with each of you during that time. These are my suggestions, but you do what works for you. But I told them, and like I said, I talked to my son-in-law, if you had me hanging out on a respirator or anything else in the NICU or whatever, I'm a haunch behind you. So they're very clear about that. Do not let me linger just for, because my wife said, well, I'm going to keep you on the machine as long as possible. I'm like, y'all heard that, right? So do what I'm asking you to do. Have those conversations about what's meaningful for you before, during, and after. They should not be, now I know some people, I know when I got married over 30-some-odd years ago, as soon as we got married, my mother-in-law showed me, these are my funeral plans and this is what I want in my, she had already done her obituary in the program. All the people who on the program are dead. What do we do then, right? So the thing is, having those conversations about what's meaningful for you, what you feel is good, is wonderful, is helpful. And then be able to have that dialogue so that when that time comes, they're going to experience the grief anyway. But why have extra problems on top of that of trying to guess what you may want, as well as taking care of their own needs during that time? So that's where I sort of land with everything. And even though I've also seen many issues where people may have been raised in a religious setting, because I was around death a lot growing up. Like I said, my dad was a pastor, so we had funerals all the time. So it was not such a novelty for me. I've seen where people have grown up with a particular religion, but as an adult, they made choices to express their spirituality in different ways. Then when they got a serious life-limiting diagnosis, then they're having to think about, okay, what do I really believe? What is really important for me? And people have to have space to make those kinds of decisions. And when making those decisions, it's best to talk about it with those who are going to be directly involved in decision-making when you can't make decisions. So let them know what's something. I don't know, people like, my mom used to tell us before she had Alzheimer's, I don't like the amount of money that people throw in the ground for funerals. Dig a hole and roll me in it. Like, then you want me arrested? No. But we had compromised on some things well before Alzheimer's had set in. So when the time came, I was so much at peace. I was able to do both of their eulogies. I was at peace because we talked about it. So my thing is, as I'm bringing the spiritual aspect, talk about it. Have the conversations, not just what you want, but those who are going to be directly affected, what do they want? How will this be for them? You want it as meaningful as possible for all involved.
Thank you so much, Taylor. We appreciate that. We've got about 10 minutes or so that I think we may talk among ourselves a bit, and then we're really hoping that you guys will come forward, take the microphone, speak up, whatever, share your concerns, thoughts, questions that you may have regarding any of this. There's such lots of different aspects of it. Yes.
Would y'all answer one question? Where is the place of death doulas? I just learned about what a death doula is, and I just want to know, where is the place? Should you hire someone, because it's for charge, should you hire someone if the family can agree, or if there is no disagreements? I just want to know where you think it fits.
So I know Jack can talk about that.
Yes, because I am also trained as a death doula, or I prefer to say end-of-life doula. And personally, I don't charge for my services, but yes, you can hire an end-of-life doula, and they can facilitate this process. I love the word that you used, Mary, about choreographing the dying process, and that's a big part of what doulas do at end of life. I think of it in sort of 3 buckets. One is helping people with legacy work. So, and that can be expressed in many different ways. It might be a notebook, it might be an artistic project, it might be a video, some way that people want to leave a legacy about their life and what's important to be remembered. The other is this choreographing, the actual dying process and sitting vigil with people. And in response to your question, sometimes that is because of concerns about family matters, and they want to have people there and some people not there, and the doula can help ensure that those wishes are honored. And then the other part is through the grief process, sort of helping family members deal with that afterwards. Although I personally don't do a lot of grief work because I depend on people like you who are better trained in that area than I am. But I think it sort of depends. For me, it's the way I think of it is the things that hospice would really like to be able to do, but they can't do because they can't afford to.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I don't know as much about it as I would like to, but I've had a handful of patients who have had death doulas that have been incredibly impactful, and it's been a very positive experience. Then I was actually curious, I didn't realize you were trained, what does the training process look like? Is there a board that certifies, how do we know if someone's truly trained versus not?
It's a pretty new role. So there are a number of organizations that do it. When I did it, it was a very intense process, a very deeply spiritual process. We spent, for instance, 3 months imagining that we were dying within 3 months and going sort of through that process and coaching each other through that process. But I would say, it's like anything else. It's like hiring a psychiatrist or a coach. It's partly what your training is, and partly do you have a good connect with that person. So I'm going to tell you, I'm not the best person if you want a lot of Reiki and massage and stuff like that. There are doulas who do that. I am going to be more the person who's going to help the family interface with the healthcare system, because that's my expertise. So you really have to interview people, see what their shtick is, what their strengths are as a doula.
And it's also important with death doulas, because if you really think about it, death doulas have been around for many years. We've just done it in an informal way. What's the reasoning for it? What's the goal for it? If it's for the person not to die alone, I know we used to have at the hospital a No One Dies Alone program for a while, where we trained people and they just sat with the person so that because it's really hard on staff when they see a patient dying and no one is in the room with them. It's very hard on staff. So having that person in the room, legacy work is so important. But that's also something that can happen before the active dying process has begun, for instance. Some oncology patients that I deal with, when they have been given life-limiting time, I'm like, okay, let's talk about some of your goals. Who is a part of your family? Who's important to you? Well, I have these grandchildren. There's, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Now, you don't know, we don't have a magic ball for when you are dying, but we know it's going to happen. What is something you want to leave these grandchildren as far as wisdom, advice, thoughts, whatever? Those are some letters that can be written. Somebody else can write it and just have their hand signature. The signatures mean so much after death for loved ones. And even for teenagers, linking objects. I know for my kids, they have those linking objects for their grandparents, and it's very precious to them. So finding out the motives, what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? That gets to be that spiritual, emotional health that we need to make sure happens. So there are many different ways we can accomplish things. I still invite people to not wait until the active death process to begin some of these things.
I couldn't agree more. And video is becoming
Yes.
a really powerful way to do that now.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up. Sorry, is it okay to just keep having a conversation? I think the legacy work is such an important process, and it's therapeutic both for patients but also for family members. There's an official form of legacy work called dignity therapy that has a standardized set of 12 questions that are focused around meaning. What are the events in your life that you're most proud of? There's a wonderful social worker at UNC, Ellen Mazier, who's trained in dignity therapy, and it's a long process. So again, talking about doing these things early on, we're not talking about the last days of life, but when you get a diagnosis, you still have the time and the energy to talk about this. It's a 3 to 4 hour interview, but you answer all these questions and then create this, basically this book that can be 9 to 10 pages long, 20 pages long, pictures, and it becomes this heirloom that's therapeutic for the person in the life process, that it can be handed down to family members, and I've found that to be really, really powerful for people.
What's the social worker again?
Her name is Ellen Ozier, O-Z-I-E-R. She left UNC and then came back, and she actually joined, so I think she's back at UNC. Yeah, she just came back a couple weeks ago. Sorry, Ellen, hopefully it's okay to announce that.
She's wonderful.
I just had a question. You mentioned hospice, less than 6 months. Is that pretty universally the definition?
Yeah, so that's the CMS criteria, is that a physician has to think that your prognosis is likely less than 6 months. Again, we're notoriously bad at predicting how long people live, and dementia is one of the most difficult ones, where people may be on hospice for 2 or 3 years, or they may be on for a year and then come off. But yeah, there are a list of qualifying conditions, whether it's cancer, heart failure, or COPD, dementia, and then the prognosis of less than 6 months to qualify for it. So people may live longer than that, but that's the universal threshold.
Can I just add that I think as long as we're educating people, that many people think hospice is a place, whereas most hospice is delivered at home. Maybe you can speak more on that.
Yeah, hospice is a service, not a place. It is an approach to caring for people when their focus becomes on quality of life, living as well as possible for the time you have left, but not undergoing aggressive medical interventions, going back to the hospital and prolonging life. And there's an interdisciplinary team of a physician who oversees it, a nurse who's the primary person that interacts, comes at least once a week, but can be available 24 hours a day. There's nursing aides, there's a chaplain, and a social worker, and so they really do this wonderful job of providing this interdisciplinary holistic care. But then to your point, there are limitations in terms of staffing, and so I do love that the end-of-life doula really sort of extends and does the things that hospice wishes they could do, but don't have the staffing or time to do it.
So I was a medical power of attorney for my dad, who passed last summer, and also for my mom, who's 93. And I have two sisters, and we're all in each other's business and all over everything, which is great. Well, I was a speech pathologist for 41 years, and so I had some experiences along the way that allowed me to see things a little bit differently. And one of the discussions that I had with my sisters and with my parents, as my parents both got a little older and their quality of life was better, at sometimes worse, at sometimes, was the difference between the DNR and the living will. And they were, every time I tried to have the discussion, my dad said, oh, our will already talks about that. And I'm like, no, a DNR is something totally different. And so I think that's an important thing, and that discussion probably happens every time you go to the hospital or everything else as you get older, or you have more of a terminal kind of an illness. But I think that's an important, big discussion to have.
So I'm just, while we're educating briefly, I love that point. I won't stay on my soapbox too long, but I think advanced directives are wonderful. Having a living will is great, but in some ways, people think they've just checked the box, and because I have a living will, I don't need to have the conversations. Oh, I don't even need to think about code status, my DNR, etc. And you're right, a lot of people don't realize that your code status is for here and now, your present self, what you want medical professionals to do. If your heart were to stop, you have a natural death. A living will is about your future self. If you get onto life support or have an irreversible condition or develop dementia and don't recognize people, what you would want in the future, it doesn't say anything about what you want in this exact current moment in time. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
I'm going to hit you with a two-pronged approach. I'm going to give you a little brief background. I was raised with my grandparents from the age 3, so my joke has always been I've been around elderly people all my life. My grandmother died at 15. My biological father committed suicide in a pond about 100 yards from the back of our house when I was 16, so I'm well acquainted with death. But I went to dental school here in Carolina and undergrad. And I'm bringing this up for a reason. In 1990, I've been in practice for 48 years. I retired in 2021. In 1990, I don't know if you guys really thought about this much, but I was looking at what was happening to the population of patients we were going to be seeing. And I'm talking specifically of geriatrics. I started concentrating on that because I started seeing what happens to the elderly along the line. A lot of prescriptions you guys are writing are causing xerostomia to dry them out. And these patients are also not compliant. They're on high carbohydrate diet, sugar, high acidic drinks, Cokes, lemonade, stuff like that. And that stuff is just sitting in your mouth, and I've seen them lose their teeth in 6 months. Let alone the pain and the infection these patients are receiving. But I bring it up simply because it is a complicated factor in all of this. And I don't hear very much from you guys about it, but I know what I had to deal with. Now, I bring up the second point of this because it's personal. My wife has dementia. I retired in 2021. We had everything laid out. We had our wills made, our medical directives made. We had our DNRs. And I never thought that my wife was going to be coming down with dementia. I had not planned on that. It came to a crisis in 2022, maybe 23, because it's right around the time of my first grandson, who's 2 years old. My wife actually attacked her, and she'd been attacking me. And I didn't see the forest because of the trees, you know? It was right in front of me. Now, the other factor needs to be put into this is she has ADD. She's been treated for ADD since she was about 30 years old. One of my children has. The reason I bring that is because she's been seeing a psychiatrist all this time. Most of the medication she's on and is written by him. And so we're monitoring this. Now, she was admitted to the mental ward at Duke Regional because of how my daughter, who's a paramedic, literally took her to the hospital, screaming and kicking. This is after another episode where she had been to a neurologist to be evaluated. My wife is smart. She is a very smart, intelligent woman. And she knew what was going on down there, and she just walked out. We don't have a diagnosis, and the psychiatrist is treating her, and I agree, we don't need that right now. Let's just deal with it, and if something else comes up later, we will, because we did not want to antagonize my wife. Now, we have got her to the point she's going to be seeing a neurologist in the near future, because the psychiatrist wants to get a handle on the tardive dyskinesia that's a side effect of one of the drugs she's on. And the whole point in all of this is we want to keep her comfortable, have a quality of life. She and I had already had the conversation. Anything happens to us, neither one of us wants to go into a nursing home. So my objective in taking care of my wife is to take care of her as best I can comfortably at home. Well, nobody ever taught me how to do this. I'm learning every day. My daughter's helping with the hygiene. We're dealing with the diet. Once we get a diagnosis from a neurologist, it's going to help a psychiatrist, and hopefully if something comes up in the future, we'll have a better way to handle that if we have to take her to a nursing home. It's the last place I'm going to put her, but until that day happens, that's what we're going to do. And so I'm throwing that out to you guys because people like me need help, and so I can help her.
Thank you for what you're doing, and I'm so sorry for the losses you've experienced, the tragedies at an early age, and even now what you're struggling with. And you pointed out so many good points that you need to have a good physician. I would advocate for a good geriatric, either a psychiatrist or a medicine doctor, to try to make sure they're not on too many medications that have side effects, and how are you going to treat that. I would also really push for you to make sure you're taking care of yourself, because the caregiver burden can be really
That's important.
intense.
I want to touch base on that just briefly, because my family sees that, and I saw that. And matter of fact, I just got back from a week's trip to Albuquerque to see my other daughter. Got 4 granddaughters there, just saw the new baby, and my daughter here in Roxborough took care of my wife. So we've got a care group here. We're trying to work together, but that point is very important. We can burn out.
There are good resources for support of that type, and afterwards, if you'd like to speak with me, I can give you several locally that really support families and patients who are dealing, particularly with dementia. That's such a tough one, and you'll see that more and more. It's hard to diagnose. There aren't great treatments. It's a terminal disease now. We know it's the 6th leading cause of death, and it's now surpassed cancer in terms of being the diagnosis most people hear the most. And I think it's because there's that sense of lack of control over so many different types, and you don't know what exactly it's going to look like. The other thing I would just be sure to emphasize, I think was already said up here too, is that this is all such a moving target, right? You have the conversation one time, maybe you've done the check boxes, but it changes, and you need to make sure you're continuing to touch base with those about how that might look. I know I already lobbied for Mayor's book. The other book, I would make sure you have, if you don't, it's been out for a while. It's a tool, Monty's book, Being Mortal. In fact, Ed was reminding me earlier today that he gave the commencement address here at Carolina in 2014, which is the year that book came out. But it's just so incredibly helpful and wonderful, and so you don't have to have it. Please get a copy. We can talk about other things. We'll have to take other questions. We got about 20 minutes, I think, before the next group's going to be coming in. Yes.
From a legal and financial standpoint, if you follow the main path in a legal state, does the life insurance company or anybody have the ability to challenge your benefits, your beneficiaries? Is it considered natural death, or is it like suicide? You said it's not suicide, but I'm just wondering, does that give the life insurance company an outlet to try to not pay?
It's not considered suicide, and I believe your life insurance, I'm not a legal expert, I should say, but I believe your life insurance benefits are safe if you choose MAID and a state where MAID is legal.
My understanding is that the medications you would get for MAID, if you would apply, are not covered by insurance typically, and that cost might be somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000.
They all know about life insurance.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with the medications is that if you're on Medicare, federal funds can't be used to pay for medications associated with MAID. So if you're over 65 and on Medicare, you would not be able to use your insurance to pay for it, but some private insurance companies do pay for it. It depends on the company and also the state. There are issues with state Medicaid as well.
In reference to something that Daryl said earlier,
how recently become acquainted with green burial? You were talking about throwing your mother into a hole. Is that legal everywhere? Is it becoming more prevalent? I had a relative that was buried in Massachusetts in a green burial, and I understand where I live, there's maybe a couple of churchyards. But it's fascinating to me. Maybe if people don't know about it, maybe want to go and describe it and answer those questions.
I know, I think there's, it's in Orange County. Lucien. Yes. And, because I know some of our chaplain residents have gone out there. I did not throw my mother.
well, you made a reference that we don't go to jail or something.
Right,
It probably wasn't legal.
yeah.
I don't know.
But I think it's a wonderful option. I mean, there's so many different options out there for people as far as if it's burial. Of course, if they're going to be buried on their land, there's certain things stipulations you have to make, because you have to designate that area as a cemetery. And different counties have different statutes, so there's no like across the North Carolina.
Is it becoming more prevalent? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Is it legal in all states?
I don't know about all states, but I know Lewiston in Orange County, and there's also aquamation, and so a number of different
What is
options.
aquamation?
Instead of cremation with fire, you're using water
For ashes or for body?
for the body. Yeah. It's considered more ecologically.
Yeah.
There's a great film called A Will for the Woods, a documentary film about a physician actually at Duke a number of years ago who had a cancer diagnosis and wanted to have a green burial and actually was instrumental in the development of a green burial ground. I think it's in Wake Forest. I'm not sure. Okay. Yes. Anyway, great film that kind of walks through his death journey, but also provides some broader context on the green burial movement.
What's the title of it again?
A Will for the Woods.
A Will for the Woods. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make a note about how important your regular family physician is. When my mother died 25 years ago now, and I still cry, our family physician said, "You're killing your father," because I was thinking about this poor gentleman, he was trying to take care of my mother. And the family physician said, "You're killing your father, you got to do something." And that was on the wake up. I just wanted to say that a great place to find information is Senior Citizens of Guilford County. That's the county I live in, and that's the senior citizen program that they have.
They have book clubs on being immortal. They have funeral directors come. They have doulas come. They have programs every month and have a discussion. And so that is one thing. If you get on their mailing list, if you see a topic that you like, it's free. It is free. It's usually very good.
Essentially, every county in North Carolina has a Department of Age. You can like go to those specific websites and see what they're offering.
I think the last time I needed a microphone was 1983. I want to ask a question you may not be able to answer, but it's fun to think about. Compare and contrast death today to death and dying a century ago. And as you said, people have been doing it for a long time, and I feel like they didn't have these panels that I'd love to know who put this together. It's fantastic. But when I ask what happened a century ago, I have trouble getting my head around these kinds of questions.
Life expectancy a century ago probably wasn't over 50. So when we think of as old age now, it was very different back then. So people died a lot sooner. They didn't have antibiotics, surgical procedures. Deaths, I think, by and large, were known. So people had experienced somebody dying at home. Now, the majority of deaths are in hospitals or ICUs, even though the majority of people say that's not where they want to die, which is another reason to have the conversations and write it down, because that's what typically will happen. I don't know if they have other thoughts about how it's different.
I just think death was more a part of life 100 years ago. I remember my dear grandmother, the one who died when I was young, who, whenever he would say goodbye, he would say, okay, I'll see you at Christmas, and she would say, she was Irish, she would say, it could be spared. And so it was just thought that you didn't have the expectancy that was going to go on. And I was thinking, just this week, I don't know why this came across my mind. I don't know about you, but when I was a little child, I prayed, now I'm laying down to sleep. I prayed, the Lord, my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, it was just ingrained in us, right? That life was not a given and expected in us.
Very different.
Now we want to control everything, right? We want to imagine that somehow we're going to hold death at its door, away from our door.
Yeah, just with all these amazing breakthroughs we have for treating cancer, for life support, I mean, there's this sense of victory and fighting and winning, and that's beautiful, but I think that has totally changed the culture, the way we think about death and dying. It's made those conversations much more difficult. So.
I also think there are a lot more options with how people celebrate others' lives, with deaths, and how they want to do it. One time, you wouldn't think of having a funeral outside of a religious edifice. Now people do all kinds of things. So I think there's a lot more options as well. Yes, we are death-defying, but I think there's still a lot more options as to how we celebrate people's lives as well.
I just want to make one comment. The comment about not eating to expedite death, that is a real thing in the county I grew up in, eastern North Carolina. My aunt quit eating so she could leave the farm to her son. If she had gone into a nursing home, every penny would have been spent. So she quit eating and let everybody know that. I mean, that is a big deal. That's sad that society has to do this. So I just wanted to say. And the other thing is, I can remember growing up and an uncle dying or a great uncle dying. We went and stayed at their house. The body was in the house for 2 or 3 days until the funeral. And you shared, you talked, you ate, you celebrated, told the stories, and I loved it being a kid. I got to see everybody. So.
Yeah, good too. I get lots of casseroles.
Yeah, I actually sat with someone, and this is many years ago, in psychiatry. They were in the geriatric unit, and they were there because they had lost their family, land, because the mother had to be put in a nursing facility, and they had to use all the resources to keep up with that. And that son had a mental break because of, they had years of this land in their family, and it was just too much to deal with.
Particularly bad if it's a centennial farm.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
It's your identity. You lose your land.
Yeah.
I suspect people of this age would remember Diane Rehm and her radio show on PBS, or NPR, I guess it was, and mentioning the not eating or B-says called out. I'm not sure how many people have heard of that or even understand how that works, but she wrote a book about that and has talked about it. Her first husband died, I believe it was Parkinson's disease, and they lived in Maryland, as I recall, and they didn't have access to medical aid in dying, and he was suffering and was wanting to do something to try to hasten his death more peacefully, and he ended up not eating or drinking to lead to his death. People can do it. I understand it's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of willpower and needs a lot of support. And even though maybe prior to doing that you might not qualify for hospice, I've known at least one patient who made the decision to do that, and then she did qualify for hospice and get there involved somewhere.
I mean, it is important to have medical support if possible, right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated process. I had an interesting patient, an 85-year-old who was generally healthy, and alcohol use disorder fell, became a quadriplegic, was like, I never want to live that way, and ended up choosing to do voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, and was the same conversation really, like, did she really qualify? But once she stopped eating and drinking, then hospice came in, and hospice was able to help support, and it sounds like your family member was successful in just doing it, but oftentimes it's the same conversation. You say, I'm going to do this, and then you get a little confused, and ask people to feed you, so you have a plan of what you're going to do if that happens with medical support, and make sure that you have the support to do that. But it is a viable option if that's what people want to pursue.
Maybe got one or two more questions?
Yes. Just to kind of put in the other caveat that there's a difference between voluntarily making a decision to stop eating and the physiologic slowing down of your body in the end where your body is shutting down. And then if people force feed you, it's actually very uncomfortable and causes more problems medically than if you don't eat. So there's a little difference there, just to kind of keep that in our minds.
Can stop eating for other reasons, so that's part of the process.
Sometimes it's physiologic.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, aren't we happy now? I know this can be kind of tough stuff to talk about and hard to think about and measuring us down, but I'll just have to say, maybe as we're ending, that in my work as a geriatric psychiatrist at UNC and working with medical students and residents, and one of the things we would have at the end of a geriatric lecture series each year was they would come to our home and we would provide a meal, and we did what was called death over dinner. We had flowers and candles and usually wine, and we would go around and honor and toast somebody who was meaningful, who had died. We talked about all these questions. What is a good death? Is there such a thing as a good death? And there were some tears, granted, but there was a lot of laughter, and people said afterwards it was just such a rich and joyful experience to engage in that way, which we don't typically do. So we haven't done it. Go home, do your advanced directives, talk to your loved ones, make sure they know what you want, but talk to them again in a year or two because it's going to change. And may you continue to thrive and be a good child.